Hello and welcome. The lighting is not amazing here. Maybe my camera is just a little bit. That's a little bit better, maybe. I kind of want to show you my plant in the shot though, so we'll have to see. It's day 25, and we were in the middle of the part that I thought was kind of good. Let's see where we left off. Page 196 in the middle. And what was happening? Al Smith is giving a speech. Classic. Oh my god, there's Pearl. I have the keyboard on behind me because sometimes she walks across it and like makes a song with her feet. I'll just read and then I'll hopefully figure out where we were. Oh, I remember. He's doing a speech to say that the land board is bad, but then the very similarly named park council is good. In his speech, Smith avoided discussing legalities or constitutionality of the appropriation, the money for the parks. And he avoided, except for a single passing reference, any mention of Robert Moses. Okay, look at it. We have a concert. The Republicans tried to shift the focus back to the governor's controversial appointee and his actions. Replying on the radio the next evening, John Knight, Senate Majority Leader, said, wow, it really adds a spooky feeling to this section. Okay, now she's like trying to get me to pet her, but sorry, Pearl, I can't pet you. I'm busy reading about this crazy Senate hearing of 1924. I think it might be a different year, actually. So John Knight, the Senate Majority Leader, said on the radio, "The issue is one of law and order as against lawlessness and a violation of sacred constitutional property rights. With scarcely $1 in sight or available for payment, Robert Moses, with the written approval of Governor Smith and with the aid of the state police, seized property of the admitted value of $250,000 and excluded the owners from such property. The question as to the legality of that action is one for the courts, and it appears that the owners of this property have brought an action against Mr. Moses for large damages. This is the big reason why Mr. Moses is so much concerned at this time and why he wants an extra session and funds to pay for this property." It is, Knight said, because a curb is needed on such wanton abuse of power that a check by an outside body such as the Land Board, which Al Smith thinks is corrupt because the Land Board is made up of the property owners on Long Island. But he's saying, the Senate Majority Leader is saying that that's needed. The legislature, he said, must safeguard private property against future unlawful seizure. Attorney General Ottinger... Dad? What do you mean? Maybe that was a joke or something. Maybe you just pop into YouTube Lives and say dad to everyone. Okay, Attorney General Ottinger issued a statement detailing the extravagance of Moses' $63,000 expenditures for cars and office furnishings. But sacred constitutional property rights and the price of office furnishings weren't the issue to the steaming millions of New York City or of the state's other cities. Twice more before the session, Smith took to the air to speak. Twice more, he pounded on the theme of the few against the many, of wealth, privilege, and influence against the masses, of parks against the millionaires' golf clubs. The mailboxes of legislators were situated in 1925 in the Midway, the corridor between the Senate and the Assembly chambers on the third floor of the Capitol. Each morning, as the reporters headed for the legislative chambers, they would see those mailboxes. And after each of Smith's speeches, the mailboxes were overflowing with letters and postcards supporting the governor. Everyone wants parks. Ugh, I wish I could get Pearl in the shot better because she's being really... Oops. She's just being cute. There she is. And the press didn't help the Republicans. June 1925 was a hot news month. John Thomas Scopes was being tried in the sleepy town of Dayton, Tennessee, and among the 2 million words a day being telegraphed out of Dayton were enough to fill endless columns in the New York papers. More page one columns were devoted to speculation over the fate of Roald Amundsen, whose expedition to the North Pole hadn't been heard from in 4 weeks, until on June 19th, the Times could report Amundsen back safe. This is I like having this context because I just don't have a great timeline of news events when it's a century ago. And so I wouldn't know that Amundsen and the Scopes trial, it would take a long time for me to realize that those were happening at the exact same time. Funny. But in New York and other cities of New York State, no story was, and the Scopes trial is the evolution in schools one, I think. The Scopes monkey trial. Something about evolution. I think it's about teaching evolutions in schools. But in New York and other cities of New York State, no story was big enough to knock the park fight off page one. The Times, for example, carried during the 30 days of June 28 park fight stories. 7 in the lead spot, as well as a long summary in its Sunday magazine reprint in full of the texts of the long speeches by Knight and Smith, and 8 editorials about park fights. The editorials of all the big city papers, with the exemption of the New York Herald Tribune, notorious during the latter part of the 1920s for its espousal of the upper-class viewpoint, seemed to be vying with one another in whipping up public support for the governor's stand. I don't really know what that stand is. I would assume that they're trying to whip up support for shutting down this big Robert Moses Park proposal. The Times, in its only direct confrontation with the issue, Macy considered important in the fight. I don't understand what that sentence means. And that perhaps Moses had broken the law, but that there were more important principles invoked than that. It seems not unlikely that Chairman Moses has exceeded his legal authority, but he is acting in the interest of the people at large and of all future generations. The support for Smith and Moses spilled off the editorial pages into the supposedly impartial news columns. The paper in which this tendency was most striking was the Times, both because the paper strove so diligently for objectivity on other issues and because of its reputation. Quote, "The Times was the Bible, emerging each morning with a view of life that thousands of readers accepted as reality," its biographer, Gay Talese, was to write. They accepted it on the simple theory that what appeared in the Times must be true. The slanting in the Times' initial story on the Taylor estate fight, the verbatim recitation of all Moses' points, and the burying of Macy's was not corrected in succeeding stories. Wait, do you like my mug? It's New York Transit Museum. I think it's kind of cute. I feel like a beauty influencer. Van Sicklen's flat statement that the appropriation was illegal and a violation of both law and the constitutions of the state and nation was on page 21, and it was exactly 5 paragraphs long. More favorable stories on political developments were front-paged and allowed to run interminably. It was not just a case of inequality in space and play. The Times articles repeated, day after day, as if they were uncontested facts, the key contentions made by Moses and Smith. Story after story, for example, contained some version of the following paragraph. Wealthy members of the Timber Point Golf Club used social and political influence to try to get the commissioners to withdraw. That failing, they created the Pacagoo Land Corporation and bought the estate. Wow, so they do kind of spin it to make the wealthy landowners seem like a cabal. The key contentions of Moses' opponents were almost totally ignored. Only the most diligent readers of the Times could understand, for example, that the fact that Moses had appropriated the property without money to pay for it was of importance at all. The fact was hardly ever mentioned, and the mentions of it given were fleeting. When Ottinger revealed Moses' $63,000 expenditures for overhead, the Times buried the story on an inside page and handled it this way. Quote, Albany, what is considered here as an attempt at retaliation by the Republicans on Governor Smith for his vote of the Thayer State Park bill is contained in a letter of censure sent by Attorney General Ottinger to Robert Moses. Moses' reply attacked the Attorney General for delays in searching title for proposed park acquisitions. It all but ignored the overhead. A Times editorial said, Chairman Moses' reply is a model of moderate statement. As the crucial special session neared, the Times began to resemble a Democratic House organ. Its article on the eve of the session said, the governor believes in parks. He loves them. The governor is well aware that he has a stiff battle ahead and is preparing to meet the situation with his usual vigor and undaunted courage. His motives for calling the special session, quote, a contest that may add a new epoch to the annals of the state, the article said, were clear. An abiding faith that the public can force this legislation in its own interest. Other possible motives, such as an upcoming all but indefensible court action, were never mentioned. Part of the explanation for the Times' attitude was the friendship of Adolph S. Ochs, O-C-H-S. This is a totally new character. This is back when people were named Adolph. Adolph S. Ochs, the self-made man from Knoxville, who had become its owner and guiding spirit. The Times' owner, the New York Times, I'm assuming. With the self-made man from the 4th Ward. Wait, so that's Al Smith. So, okay, so it's me. I'm assuming that this paragraph means that the owner of the New York Times is friends with the governor, Al Smith, who supports the parks, and Al Smith and Moses are working together. During the 1920s, Smith regularly spent summer weekends at Ochs' summer home on Lake George. Part was the intense interest of Ochs, the only living child, Iphigene, Iphigene, Iphigene's husband, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, Sulzberger's niece-in-law, Mrs. Cyrus L. Sulzberger, of a whole clutch of Ochs and Sulzbergers, in fact, in parks. Okay, so this is the owner of the New York Times, who has a bunch of family members who are interested in parks, apparently. The old patriarch himself took a particular interest in preserving the Saratoga battlefield. In 1927, Moses, trying to buy up those portions not yet owned by the state, would find himself short of money, and Ochs would purchase 2 key parcels and hold them for the state until the money was available. In 1925, Mrs. Cyrus L. Sulzberger was active in the Park Association of New York City. Iphigene, a somber-eyed and idealistic young matron, deeply concerned with social problems, had already begun to channel the idealism and a remarkable amount of enthusiasm and energy that was concealed but not muted by her serene manners and gentle voice into Park Association work. Okay, so his daughter, the daughter of the New York Times owner, also cares about parks. And her name is Iphigene, which is a name I don't think I've ever heard before, but it's like Imogene. She had been, she would tell the author 40 years later, thrilled by Moses' state park work and anxious that the city should also get moving. And in 1925, she was active on a park association committee that was mapping a vast city land acquisition program and that listened raptly to Moses, who had agreed to help them work it out. The feeling of the publisher and his family showed up in the news columns of the Times, probably not as a result of any direct orders to editors or reporters, but as the result of their understandable sensitivity to their boss's feelings. Albert L. Warner, one of the paper's Albany reporters, recalls, I really want to have a count going of all the people named Albert in this book, all the different ones. I feel like we could do that pretty easily if you just had a text file of this book, which is definitely available online somewhere. Maybe I'll do this if I need to procrastinate other things. Okay, so one of the paper's Albany reporters recalls, quote, "Parks and conservation, they were so dear to Mr. Ock's heart and consequently dear to the hearts of Times editors. So I was on the lookout for any attempt to interfere with parks. Not that I had specific instructions to do so, but the editors would react favorably to park and conservation stories. So the reporter naturally keeps his eyes alert for stories of this type. When, in 1931, Ox received the annual award of the Park Association, wow, I didn't, okay, sorry, I keep pausing, but I didn't realize that the Park Association had an annual award at all. And the places where my head is going is like, do they still do that? Who's winning it now? Is there a Wikipedia article about this park award? Anyway, the lettering on the illuminated scroll said, "The New York Times, under his leadership, has made itself the mouthpiece of Friends of the Parks, using its great influence to educate the public to an understanding of the place of the parks in modern life." Whatever the reason, the daily press coverage of the park fight made Smith and Moses look very good, and the Republican legislators look very bad. The Republican legislators realized this. Faced with an election campaign in November, many of them from New York and downstate districts began to panic. But Hillies, I don't know who that is, and GOP National Committeeman George K. Morris, representatives of the powers that ran the party, traveled to Albany and held them in line with naked threats and blandishments. And the upstate legislators didn't have to be concerned about November. One man, one vote upstate agitation was decades in the future. I don't know what that is. These legislators represented New York State's rotten boroughs, districts whose voters numbered in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands, and who were farmers who had no interest in parks and who were, moreover, fanatically opposed to government spending. The idea of spending millions for parks had appalled them in the first place. The bond referendum might have rolled up a statewide majority of more than 1 million. But with a single exception, Ulster, where old park philanthropist Judge Alphonse Trumbore Clearwater took the stump for it, every upstate county had voted against it. Upstate New York in 1925 was a stronghold of prohibitionism, of Protestantism, of prejudice, of Ku Klux Klanism, and of Republicanism. Opposing Smith's park policies could only help upstate Republican legislators, not hurt them. As the legislators arrived in Albany for the special session, bitter against being called to the Capitol in the summer heat, reporters asked them if there was any chance of a change in their position. "We'll melt in our seats first," one said. When a reporter asked Knight if he might change his mind, Knight replied, "I don't change my mind very often, do I?" Nonetheless, Smith smote them hip and thigh. Okay. The Republicans held a majority of 7 in the Senate and 42 in the Assembly. He had to switch 4 votes in the Senate and 22 votes in the Assembly to win. He sent Moses and the other emissaries to the Republican members of the State Council of Parks, the old men who had been fighting for parks for decades, and asked them to intercede with the legislators from their districts. The park philanthropists were men who ordinarily held influence in Republican councils. No legislator from a district anywhere near the headwaters of the Hudson dared publicly to oppose Judge Clearwater's wishes. At a Republican caucus, the park philanthropists spoke one after the other. Not a single legislator dared openly to argue against them, but they had their orders. A reporter wrote that when the speeches were finished, the Republican leaders sat speechless until they finally filed their terse refusal to reconsider and quit the conference. Persuasion having failed, the governor, also we're officially on page 200. Persuasion having failed, the governor tried other methods. Westchester, he saw, was a weak spot in the Republican wall. Boss William Ward wanted a new charter for the county, one that would centralize its governments under his thumb. and the necessary county referendum on the charter could be authorized only by the legislature and the governor. A bill authorizing the referendum happened even then to be awaiting Smith's signature or veto. Moses paid a visit to Ward and one of Ward's senators, Seabury C. Mastick. Smith signed the bill, and soon political observers were reporting that Ward had promised Smith the votes of the 7 legislators he controlled, and that Mastick might even introduce the park bill Smith wanted. I know, it's really exciting to be on page 200. It's taken so long. Now I always forget the exact page count, but it's like 1,100 something. So I'm really not close at all, but I'm getting closer. 1,169. I think. Wait, actually, no. Actually, 1,161. All right, so basically they need to get the votes for this big like $200,000 park bill. All the farmers upstate are like, no, we don't want to spend that much state money on parks. Like, we don't need parks. We have farms. And so now Governor Al Smith is like, I have to convince a few upstate people. And so they're going to try to get the people from Westchester because of a little political favor quid pro quo moment happening. The Citizens Union and City Club reformers had great influence with Republican legislators from New York City. Smith sent Moses to see them. The younger reformers admired Moses. Many of the older men were disenchanted with him, but they believed in the cause for which he was fighting, and they rallied to it. Park development should be determined by sound principles. These sound principles, the Citizens Union believes, were outlined by the State Council of Parks. With reformers who still had doubts, Smith lent a hand. When, in a chat in the City Club lounge, lawyer Joseph M. Price told Moses that perhaps a central supervisory body, such as the land board, wasn't a bad idea. And remember, they hate the land board because they think it's rich golf clubs. So he's like, wait, maybe this lawyer is like, maybe the land board isn't a bad idea. Moses excused himself, went to the telephone, and called Smith in Albany, and hardly had the chat ended when Price received a telegram from the governor explaining why the land board idea was bad. Reformer William B. Rowellstone boarded a train to Buffalo in a single day, persuaded the Buffalo Council of Catholic Women, the Buffalo Civic Club, and the Buffalo Central Labor Council to pass resolutions supporting Smith's stand, and then headed for Syracuse and a dozen other upstate cities and towns. The upstate park philanthropists were out working too. Old Judge Clearwater himself driving night after night to little villages to talk on their local radio stations. I'm really romanticizing the idea of driving around upstate New York and going on the radio stations of like podunk towns and being like, you should vote for the parks. It just kind of sounds like a fun life. Like, I want him to have a memoir. Franklin D. Roosevelt of Hyde Park. Wait, what? I'm going to start the sentence over. The upstate park philanthropists were out working too. Old Judge Clearwater himself driving night after night to little villages to talk on their local radio stations. Franklin D. Roosevelt of Hyde Park assailing the invisible hand behind the Republican policy. Is there a Hyde Park in upstate New York? Hyde Park? Yeah, there totally is. I know there's Hyde Park in London. And there's definitely Hyde Park in Chicago. That's a neighborhood that I lived in, and it's right by the Museum of Science and Industry and the University of Chicago. And sometimes I would get like mixed up because there's so many Hyde Parks. But yeah, totally. I'm just stupid. There's a Hyde Park in like right in the Hudson Valley, and it's the hometown of FDR. And it has a population of 20,000 people. I really think that I should have known that this existed, but it's a good enough day to learn as any other day. Yeah, I like public transit too. And I don't know if you were here, but I just bought this public transit museum mug because my new apartment is really close to it. Okay. Then Smith and Mrs. Moskowitz conceived a master stroke. they told Moses to call a meeting of the 73 regional park commissioners and to hold it in the executive chamber at 2 p.m. June 22, just 6 hours before the opening of the special session. A move that ensured that the influential commissioners would be on hand during the session, available to bring further pressure on wavering legislators. Ooh. And to dramatize to press and public the contrast between attitudes of the legislature and of men genuinely interested in parks. GOP leaders pleaded with their commissioners not to attend, telling them that they were working against their own party, but the old men were loyal to their parks. They canceled vacation and business trips, and all but 19 of the 73 were present, packed into the visitors' gallery of the Assembly Chamber, along with the largest crowd the chamber had ever held. I really think this book is just full of like zingers, like facts that are just like, wow. But this is crazy. It's the largest crowd the chamber has ever held, and it's about the park bill. As Smith, speaking not from the raised speaker's chair, but from the well of the chamber, a spot where he had stood so many times before, stood so close to the senators, seated on folding chairs brought in specially for the occasion, that he could touch them. And he told them, "You created the State Parks Council. I kept politics out of it by appointing it to these men, mostly Republicans. They include some of the greatest men in the state. And it's their plan, not mine, that you're killing." Smith's speech brought the packed galleries to their feet, cheering. This is really exciting. Smith had asked the legislature for permission to have his speech broadcast. So I'm assuming that's radio because it's 1925. It had not dared refuse. 4 microphones had been set up in the assembly chamber well, and as the cheers thundered down on the legislators, they could look at the microphones and know that they were being echoed throughout the state of New York. Does the window plant have a name? No, I've never named it. I really, especially this week, I just love this plant, and it's doing so well, except for this one bad leaf. I actually need to probably get rid of this bad leaf. But I got this plant when it was like a wee little, it was probably about the size of this lamp back when I got it. It was like small. You can see how small it used to be. And it's from Trader Joe's. And it has just really like been really good. Oh, the podcast. Okay, what happened to it was like I did it for about a year maybe. And then after we did it for a while, all of us kind of got busy with other things. So we were like, we're going to go on hiatus. And then we just kind of never came back from the hiatus because I don't know. It was a little bit of work and I felt like not super proud of it. And I kind of, oh, it's no longer on Spotify. Yeah, I don't know. I definitely have the files sitting around on my computer. So it's not gone forever. If you email me and you like want the files, I can send you the files. Okay, anyway. All right, so everyone's watching this. Everyone's tuned into this state lawmaking session. But when the Republican legislators emerged from behind the closed and guarded doors of their caucus, not a single one, not one from New York City, not even one from Westchester County, was still supporting Smith. What? Not only would the GOP not segregate the funds Smith asked for, but by a straight party line vote, the legislature repassed the identical bill that Smith had vetoed. With the legislature confronted by an outpouring of public pressure as great as any in the state's history, the barons of Long Island had laid down the law to the lawmakers, and their orders had been obeyed. I can't believe this. The roll call in the Senate was completed at 5 p.m., in the Assembly at 6:30 p.m. At exactly 7, the governor again vetoed the bill in a sequence that a Times reporter wrote is likely to set a mark in legislative history for the record-breaking speed with which it went the route from legislative approval to executive condemnation. Bitterness roiled over Albany. In a voice shaking with emotion, John Knight, usually so stolid, stood at his Senate desk and cried, "Smith ought to sign this bill instead of dancing up and down like a spoiled child." John Knight is the majority leader of the Republican Party. People on Long Island are afraid to go to bed for fear that when they wake up in the morning, they would find their property seized by Robert Moses, another Republican senator shouted. Jumping out of his seat, a Democrat replied, "Is it not true that if they don't go to bed on Long Island, it is because the bed sheets may be used elsewhere?" A reference to the KKK? Oh, wow, that was kind of subtle. And Jimmy Walker, his suavity gone for a moment, his cravat for once askew, shook his fist at the Republican senators and shouted, "These millionaires made their millions out of the poor, despised, um, those are probably bad words, I'm assuming, from tenements, whom through you they are now seeking to shut out from a day in the country." I'm just scared. I just want to be really careful to not say things that might be bad. From the governor's chambers, Smith thundered that sealed orders had been delivered to the GOP. The Westchester delegation had welched, he said. Seabury Mastic had promised him support. He did not say what he had promised to Mastic in exchange. I don't know who. Oh, Seabury Mastic. I'm like not totally remembering, but I think that might be one of the rich people from Long Island. Mastic later had confessed to him that there had been brought to bear on him too much pressure for him to resist. Others quoted Mastic as saying that he had been told bluntly that if he supported Smith, my career would end. Seabury Mastic. I forgot who that is. Oh well. The facts which confronted Smith and Moses after the special session were as bitter as the shouting. Not a cent had been appropriated for park acquisition or development. The option on the 2 miles of beachfront at Hampton Bays was lost, and the land was promptly bought by 3 developers who divided it into lots and began to erect bungalows on them. The option on Sunken Meadow was lost, and while the land was not sold, its value had obviously been tripled or quadrupled by the publicity. That's actually quite interesting. Other property on Long Island that Moses had coveted was being swallowed up by real estate developments. More importantly, politically at least, there was still no money to lacquer even a veneer of legality over the ugly surface of the Taylor estate appropriation. I kind of like the phrase lacquer even a veneer of legality. An angry Justice Van Sicklen had scheduled the Taylor estate trial for September 1 and had said that no further delays would be tolerated. On that date, Macy was at last going to get Moses on the witness stand, and Moses was going to have to admit that he still didn't have money available to pay Macy for the property he had taken from him. Smith and Moses might have reaped a windfall in the political arenas of Albany, but they knew that advantage would be lost when the act they were defending was flatly declared illegal. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to stop. I'll try to be back tomorrow. Although tomorrow's weird because I have a dentist appointment in the morning. We'll see. Maybe I'll be back tomorrow, maybe not. Goodbye. That was a really exciting moment. Truly like such a twist that the bill didn't pass after all of that. Okay. Goodbye. I hope you have a good rest of your day. We're on page 202 now. This is where we are.